There was a lighthouse keeper who had been at his post for 30 years. He knew every warning sign of a storm, the way pressure dropped before a front moved in, the specific gray-green color of the water at dusk when the barometric readings were falling fast, the behavior of seabirds, how they went quiet and stopped flying hours before a serious system arrived, almost as if they already knew what was coming. He knew more about storms than almost anyone alive. The night the worst storm of the century hit his coastline, he was at his post. He saw every single sign. He watched the whole system approach. He could have predicted it hours in advance. And the ship still crashed on the rocks. Not because he didn't know. Because knowing, over 30 years of watching, had quietly replaced doing. His eyes were still open. His urgency was gone. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you know the signs of the times. You've studied Matthew 24. You've read about the convergence of events unfolding right now, wars, rumors of wars, the alignment of nations, the prophetic patterns in Scripture that seem to be accelerating faster than anyone expected. You might know more about end-time signs than 90% of the people sitting in your church this Sunday. And that knowledge feels like spiritual readiness. It isn't. Not automatically. Not if you don't understand something that almost no one in the biblical prophecy space is willing to say out loud. There is a specific danger that grows inside the person who studies prophetic signs deeply, and it isn't the danger of being wrong about the timeline or misreading a passage. It's something far more invisible than that. Something the most informed, the most watchful, the most doctrinally careful believer is actually more vulnerable to, not less. And if you stay with this until the end, you'll understand not just what that danger is, but exactly what to do about it before this week is over. Researchers who study high-expertise fields have documented a pattern they call the competence trap. It works like this. The more deeply someone becomes an expert in recognizing the warning signals of a system, weather patterns, financial indicators, medical symptoms, the more their brain begins to treat recognition as response. The neural pathway that fires when they see a warning sign starts to produce the same internal sense of completion as acting on it. Watching feels like doing. Seeing feels like responding. Emergency response trainers work against this deliberately. They know that seasoned professionals, the people who have seen the most, are the most susceptible to it. Not because they stop caring, because expertise itself creates the illusion of readiness. Now hold that thought. Because here is something about the prophetic tradition in Scripture that almost every end times discussion skips past. The prophets of Israel didn't bring their most urgent warnings to pagan nations who had never heard of God. They brought them to God's own people, to the insiders, to the ones who already knew the covenant, who could recite the law from memory, who understood exactly what was at stake. Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, their most urgent calls weren't addressed to Babylon. They were addressed to Jerusalem. Because proximity to truth, without active response to it, produces a specific kind of spiritual blindness that's harder to break than ordinary ignorance. You don't feel blind when you're in it. You feel informed. Go back to the lighthouse keeper and look more carefully at what happened not at the moment of the storm, but in the decade before it. At some point, he stopped stocking the emergency supplies, not because he forgot what they were for. He could have explained their purpose to anyone who asked. But the act of knowing felt so much like the act of preparing that the actual preparation kept getting postponed. There was always time. At some point, he stopped rehearsing the rescue procedures. He still remembered them, the steps, the sequence, the protocol. They were stored in his mind like files in a drawer. But files in a drawer are not muscle memory, and muscle memory only exists in a body that uses it. And then the most dangerous thing of all. The light was still spinning, still working, but somewhere in year 28 he started leaving the lamp room for longer stretches, not permanently, just often. The mechanism kept turning because the mechanism was built to turn. It had become automatic. He was in the building, but not in the room. This is precisely what Jesus described in Matthew 24, not as a warning for people who had never engaged with Scripture, but as a warning for his disciples, for the people already in the room. Be ready, he said. Not be informed, not be watching, be ready. And then, in the very next chapter, he told a parable that most prophecy teaching treats as a footnote, but may actually be the sharpest edge of everything he said. 10 women, all of them waiting for the same event. All of them had heard the announcement. All of them knew the bridegroom was coming. All of them showed up. The difference between the wise and the foolish was not their knowledge of the event. It was the oil. And here is the line in that passage that should stop every serious student of biblical prophecy cold. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." And the wise answered, "There may not be enough for both of us." Real spiritual readiness cannot be borrowed in a moment of emergency from someone who built it over years of practice. It cannot be transferred by information. It cannot be crowdsourced the night the bridegroom arrives. Information can be shared, oil cannot. Which raises the question that everything in this video has been circling. What is the oil? It isn't knowledge about when the bridegroom is coming. The foolish virgins had that. They were there because they had it. It isn't theological fluency. It isn't even genuine desire they wanted to get in. The oil in the lamp of the wise virgins wasn't information. It was intimacy. And intimacy cannot be accumulated. It can only be maintained. The keeper's light kept spinning, but the keeper was no longer in the room. The light looked operational from the outside. From a distance, everything appeared fine. That is what spiritual unpreparedness looks like in a person who has studied biblical prophecy. It doesn't look like ignorance. It doesn't look like faithlessness. It looks like a well-informed believer whose light is technically still spinning, but who has been spending less and less time in the lamp room. This is the part of the conversation that's uncomfortable. The person who is most likely to hear this and think, "That's not me," is, statistically, the person most likely to be in exactly this position. Because the expert always trusts their expertise. The keeper trusted his for 30 years. Right up until the moment it wasn't enough. So here is what returning to the lamp room actually looks like. Not as vague encouragement, but as 3 specific, concrete postures you can begin before this week ends. The first is unscheduled prayer. Not prayer that happens because your calendar says it should, or because a crisis has arrived and you need something. Prayer that happens because you are a person who prays, the way the lighthouse keeper who actually takes his job seriously walks up to the lamp room on a quiet night, even when there's nothing on the horizon. Not because the storm is visible yet, because maintenance is done before the storm, not during it. The second is scripture engagement without an agenda, not reading prophecy to decode signs, not reading Paul to understand the end-time sequence, reading the text the way you'd sit with someone you love without needing the conversation to produce something, asking not "what does this mean," but "what does this tell me about who I'm talking to?" That posture builds oil. Analysis alone does not. The third is what you might call return awareness, the daily, grounded acknowledgement that you are living in the presence of someone who is coming back, not as a doctrine you affirm when asked, as an orientation that shapes how you move through an ordinary Tuesday. The lamp room isn't a dramatic place. It's a quiet room in a tall building on a rocky coast. The keeper who shows up there every single day, regardless of the forecast, is the one who has oil when the night gets dark. These 3 practices don't make you more informed about end-time signs. They make you the keeper who is actually in the room. The lighthouse keeper who crashed the ship didn't fail because he stopped watching. He failed because watching, over 30 years, had become the whole job in his mind. when the whole job was never just watching. It was watching and maintaining the light. And the light is maintained not by knowing what it's for, or by knowing what a storm looks like approaching from the south. It is maintained by returning to the lamp room every single day, regardless of what the horizon looks like. The storm is coming, you already know that. The question worth asking right now isn't do you see it? It's whether when it arrives, you'll be in the room,